All right, well, joining us on the line today is Dr. Chuck Missler. Chuck is the founder of the Koinonia House Ministry, originally based in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and recently moved to the beautiful country of New Zealand. Chuck, great to have you on the program today.
Yes, very nice to be back with you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So why the move to New Zealand? I know it's been a few years since you made the move, but some people are wondering,
Well,
we
we just felt called to that. We do have a publishing staff in Idaho, and we still have that staff there, but we actually have consolidated our video activities in New Zealand. We are located right in the middle of the North Island, and we have a direct connect to the internet backbone. We have our own ISP. So we do most of our worldwide video broadcasts from our studios there. So we enjoy it a lot because it's a very cosmopolitan environment and almost a gateway to Asia, strangely enough. So we enjoy it there. We're surrounded on three sides by water and have our own airstrip. So it's a study center kind of place, and we enjoy it very much. We sometimes joke about it that we're glad to be offshore, so to speak. We can go for several weeks without hearing the name Obama. It's really quite wonderful.
Well, all right. So over the years, Chuck, you have focused upon the economy in your ministry. You've talked about some of the dangers that, a nation built entirely upon debt would inevitably face, talking about the history of it. What is your take on what's happening now? We haven't really had the implosion the way that some of us thought might occur back in 2010, 2011. We're still in this illusion of prosperity. The Fed has been able to pull off that wealth effect a little bit. But do you still believe we're in the middle or the eye of a hurricane? Do you believe that the worst is still yet to come?
Yes, I do. And I obviously can be wrong, but I still believe that we have not solved any of the basic problems. The so-called recovery, both Wall Street as well as Washington are trying very, very hard to create use the word yourself, illusion, the illusion of recovery. The truth of the matter is we have very, very serious fundamental economic problems. The thing that concerns me the most is the excessive debt. McKinsey global studies people did a study trying to make an estimate of the entire wealth of the planet Earth, came up with a number of about over 200 trillion in value. And what makes that number so provocative is the debt of the United States is larger than that. We always talk about the 17 trillion. The thing that we always ignore in some of those estimates is our unfunded debt, the
entitlements and whatnot.
Yeah, all the entitlements. Yeah, and so we're sitting really on an actual debt of the U.S. is about, last estimate I heard was about 211 trillion, and those are huge numbers. And the real problem is that if you do the math, there's no way that can ever be repaid with any legitimate currency. So somewhere along the way, there's going to be some kind of huge, gigantic correction. Now, we don't know two things. We don't know the form that's going to take, and we also don't know the timing. But the fact that it has an inevitability about it is what concerns me. And I guess what really concerns me most of all the population groups that we know of, the ones that are least prepared for what's coming are the citizens of the United States. In Europe, they have a sense of urgency because they have memories of tanks going through their backyards. In other words, they've actually experienced the turmoil of the past. In the U.S., we tend to look at these things more academically. But the truth of the matter is the economic predicament that we're facing, we haven't repaired anything. What bothers me, Jerry, is that even the measures we use are misleading. We keep measuring things by consumption, the consumer price index. So we consume more than we produce. And the difference between that, of course, is debt, and that keeps growing. Our problem is we've got too much debt. Our solution is to add more debt, and I don't see any reversal of that on the horizon. And so that's just one perception. A second perspective that I regard as fundamental is that, for many decades, when we do a question and answer period into speaking publicly and so forth, the questions that come up always include someone will ask the question, why hasn't God judged America? And for 4 or 5 decades, I've always hidden behind Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3 for my response. That we have been shielded from an overdue judgment because we bless Israel. For the first time in my entire history, our official posture is against Israel. that makes me very uncomfortable, not for Israel, because Israel's, God has them in the palm of his hand, and he's laid that all out. But I think the shield, in my mind, the shield at least that I used for almost 5 decades to forestall overdue judgment, is our commitment to Israel's right to exist. The fact that
Chuck,
for the first time in our history, we turned against him.
Chuck, unpack that for a moment, because whenever the average hearer listens to that and they say, well, America has turned their back on Israel, what are you referring to specifically?
First of all, the fact that we officially have in the past stood for Israel's right to exist. But let's just stand back and take a good look at our country. We outlaw the Word of God in our schools. We outlaw any naming of him in any public place. We've done everything we can imagine to undo or insult the very institutions that he has established. And even to the extent of the attack on marriage. For the Supreme Court to presume that they have the capability to define what a married couple should be is laughable, really. It's a tragic twisting, a misuse of what we call the law. So I think there's going to be an increasing civil disobedient tide coming as a result of that. But the point is, what we've really, as a culture, as in the United States, done everything to undo the very things that God ordained the concept of the family and the marriage. And for us to try to redefine that or abrogate it, the whole same-sex marriage thing is really an attack on the concept of the family in the true sense of the term. And so that gets into a whole other aspect, because I suspect that God's abandonment wrath may have already started. If we study the scriptures, we realize that there's several different wraths of God. There's the eschatological wrath that we see from Revelation 6 to 19. There is his cataclysmic wrath, if you think of Noah's flood and those kinds of things. But one of the techniques that God does indulge in is generally called the abandonment wrath. That's what he did to Samson on that last visit to Delilah. Can you imagine the terror in Samson when he attempted to break loose again and couldn't, and realized that God had abandoned him? What terror must have struck as he realized his predicament then? The same thing happens to the northern kingdom when God commissions Hosea from the south to go up there and lay out his indictment of the northern kingdom. He did not go up there from Hosea chapter 4 through 14. It isn't a preachment, unless you change, this is going to happen. No. It's a layout of what's actually been ordained to happen because you've joined yourself to idols. In fact, the way God expresses that, the summary passages, leave Ephraim alone. He's joined to idols. So what God does, he simply removes his protective hand from the northern kingdom, and the Assyrians eliminate them from the pages of history. And the same thing happens to the southern kingdom a century later under Habakkuk. The point is, one of the things that God seems to do is simply to remove his hand of protection. And what's really a shock is if you look at the book of Romans, chapter 1, from verse 18 to the end of that chapter, you discover there is a specific curse that God puts on a people that refuse to accept him as a creator. It's interesting. God has many jealousies, but his number one jealousy is his role as creator. And he has spelled out in the last half of Romans 1, he spelled out a specific judgment that he uses on a culture that fails to acknowledge him as creator. 3 times, I always thought that passage was about homosexuality. It's not really. What it's about is 3 times God says, I will give them over to that which is inconvenient, and so forth. It is a judgment, strangely enough. And that judgment is the widespread impact of homosexuality. And that whole passage from Romans 1, verse 18 to the end hammers that home. And so as I watch this strange predicament, I see the church has been asleep at the switch, that they have allowed themselves to have this same-sex marriage thing get approved all over the place. And it's a huge mistake. A huge mistake.
My guest today is Dr. Chuck Missler. He's the founder of the Koinonia House Ministry. Chuck, we were talking just now about America and the role that the church itself has played in allowing many of these things to occur. We brought up the nation of Israel. I want to go back to that for a minute because there's a question I want to ask you having to do with Genesis chapter 15.
Okay.
There, that amazing passage where the covenant is established between God and Abraham. And God expresses this idea, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." Later on, we see that same language in the book of Deuteronomy, where to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this land, this greater Israel, so to speak, this much larger land has been given to the Jew. So how do you reconcile that with the current borders of Israel? How do you reconcile that?
I suspect there's going to be an extension. Many people suspect that it may derive from Psalm 83, but there is apparently a success described by the psalmist in Psalm 83 in which he pleads with God to do something because, in fact, what it specifically focuses on is a group of nations that are the immediate neighbors of Israel. They're listed there, actually, and dealt with in detail. But the point is, from that psalm and for that petition that the psalmist puts forth, there is an expectation of some of us. I think this has been popularized by Bill Salas and others in terms of being a precedent condition to the very famous passages in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And when we contrast those two things, they're very different. The protagonists in Psalm 83 are the immediate neighbors, and the purpose of their confederation is to wipe Israel off the map. It's interesting, their identity and also their motivation is very intense, very focused. In contrast to that, we spent a lot of time studying Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, which include not the immediate neighbors, but a larger ring of protagonists that are deliberately attempting to invade Israel for spoil, gold and silver, cattle and goods. In other words, they're going to take spoil. In the Ezekiel passage, Ezekiel 13, God intervenes to prevent that invasion. And it's obviously a very famous passage because it seems to allude to the use of nuclear weapons, especially in chapter 39. But the point is, I guess, is that there are some of us that suspect that the Psalm 83 event is a necessary prelude to making Israel the target for spoil. And so that doesn't mean we're correct, but I tend to lean in with those that tend to see Psalm 83 as a preceding condition well in advance of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, there are many good scholars, I'll use Hal Lindsey as the best example, who believe that the Ezekiel 38 passage is part and parcel of the Armageddon scenario. But there are a few of us that have a little different view. We think that it's more precedent to the, so those are just, timing perceptions that I think good scholars have room to disagree on. So,
sure.
But in answer to your question there, I think the destiny of Israel's borders is something that will indeed ultimately be fulfilled. And so that's a viewpoint that I don't know if you want to try to stay there or move further, but I'll sort of leave that on your side of the court here.
Well, as far as that land, that expansive greater Israel that is talked about by God Himself and talked about in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy, Genesis, it makes me wonder: is that what God views as the Promised Land, and we have instead carved up and divided the land for gain and have given Israel a portion of it? We've given it maybe 10%, and then we have given the rest of it through the, of course, through the Sykes-Picot Treaty. We've given the other 90% to Arabs, to Muslims.
Absolutely, and God and Joel and others have a lot to say about those that would dare to partition. It's really God's land, and that's why those issues go vastly beyond just the local politics. And I think it makes
me wonder. Yeah, it makes me wonder, Chuck, if the dividing of the land occurred around Sykes-Picot, and that in some strange, very bizarre way, ISIS, in some ways, is removing those former boundaries that used to exist through Sykes-Picot that the West had imposed upon the land of "quote-unquote" Greater Israel.
That's interesting. That's a very interesting point of view. I think all of us are watching that with great fascination because there's a destiny that should unfold.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's kind of shift gears here. We've talked about Israel. We've talked about America. We talked about the economy. You have an interesting platform in the fact that you have a global ministry. You are very unique in the fact that you're aware of the economic crisis. You're aware of the foundations of the economic crisis. I would probably have to say that the majority of pastors out there and ministers in general are not aware of fiat money. They're not aware of the cycles of the economy, the way that, obviously you have studied and the way I have studied. Would you say that's true?
Oh, very much so. In fact, we just published a refreshment, updating of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The white horse, the red horse for war, and perhaps the most provocative of the 4 was the black horse, which deals with famine and inflation. And it's really a shocker to unpack, especially that 3rd horseman in terms of the classical 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And so there's no question about the fact that we've apparently stirred it up in terms of recognizing that most famines are results of government decisions. It's not a lack of food; it's a lack of credit that causes
bad policy.
The famines. Yeah. Very much so. Very much so. The really get into that and take a look at the role of credit on the history of the United States is staggering. It gets you into the whole Jackson thing. It gets you into the whole founding of the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor reserve. And it's astonishing how few people really understand the dynamics of the Federal Reserve and what it really means. But it's interesting that even it's running out of options to try to keep things going. So the whole predicament is detailed in Behold the Black Horse series. It's you speak of places where we need to upgrade the awareness of pastors. I think it's the dynamics of credit is one of the blind spots of many that would attempt to put our present predicament in perspective. The credit picture of the U.S. is bizarre and strange, and a lot of us, it's a time I don't think we can be too glib with answers. We really have to just do our homework and watch what's going to unfold here.
My guest today is Dr. Chuck Missler. He is the founder of the Koinonia House Ministry. You can find him online at khouse.org. That's khouse.org. Chuck, another question regarding the economy. I'm sure your ministry receives many, many questions about the economy. I can't even imagine how many you must receive. Some of the questions that we have received have had to do with a very popular book that's out now called The Mystery of the Shemitah by Jonathan Cahn, where he teaches that cycles within the economy are going to cause another crash, and he pinpoints the date. He says that it's going to occur, the next crash is very likely, based upon the Shemitah, which is the land Sabbath, the 7-year land Sabbath in the Old Testament. He somehow connects it to the U.S. stock market and says that now, September 13th, 2015, the U.S. stock market is going to crash based upon the Shemitah cycle.
Well, I find that very exciting because he's predicting September 13th. And we'll officially review that on the 14th of September. I'm being facetious a bit. One of the things I believe that we make a big mistake in setting dates. You see, right. Divination is prohibited in the Torah. We are prohibited from doing divination. Prophecy is not given to predict the future. Prophecy is to glorify God when that future occurs. So there's a difference. And I think we make a mistake. See, one of the problems he has with the Shemitah is that we're not sure of the grid and we're not sure of the timing. There are lots of different rabbinical presumptions that go into those forecasts. The truth of the matter, they didn't keep it, and so we don't know where the grid is, where to link it, if you will. And they even argue whether it's a 49 or 50-year cycle. That's a whole other discussion. But the point is, there are issues there that he glosses over that need better answers than we have. So that's why I think we should need to keep in mind that the purpose of prophecy is to glorify God when it happens. We are prohibited expressly from doing any date setting. And I think that's a surprising mistake of a good scholar to come out with those kind of markers, if you will, because we're only a couple months away from seeing what really comes. There is another thing that everybody overlooks, just to give you another path here before we tie off this broadcast. There's another event that nobody seems to talk about, that we have said for more than several decades is missing from our prophetic scenario. And that's the role of Babylon. And there's a lot of people that try to take it allegorically. There's some that take it literally. I think both are true. And I think that the judgment that Isaiah talks about in chapters 13 and 14, and that Jeremiah details in chapters 50 and 51, have yet to happen, where Babylon is destroyed, the building materials will never be reused, and it'll never, from that point on, ever be re-inhabited. And that's never happened in history. Babylon is there. There are ruins that have been reused, and there's a whole destiny clearly specified in Isaiah and Jeremiah. That has never happened. Now, what that means is, if we take the Bible seriously, as I think you and I do, then that implies that those predictions have yet to be fulfilled, which means that somehow Babylon, the city on the banks of the Euphrates, a literal city, is going to reemerge in significance economically, religiously, and politically. And that doesn't happen overnight. That's something that will take some time to unfold. But it's something that I look for because it is yet to happen. And that's another element that sits between us and the final climax. Are we living in the end times? I really believe it. As I've often said, I believe that we are being moved into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does about any other period of time in history. So it's our job not to predict the future, but it is our job to prepare for the coming storm. And I think it's a good time for all of us to go back and re-examine our favorite prophetic passages and put them in perspective and watch it unfold. Because I think there's going to be events occurring in the next 12 to 18 months that are just too breathtaking to try to predict.
Very interesting. One final question, Chuck, before we have to let you go. It has to do with something that happened this week. The Drudge Report, a very popular conservative news outlet, ran a story from Charisma News asking the question whether Pope Francis was the Antichrist. And of course, this is the kind of fodder that Americans have, loved to focus on. It's a lot of speculation, of course. But a major part of your ministry over the years has been dedicated to the study of Bible prophecy. I wanted to get your take. Pope Francis is on his way to America. He'll be speaking here in September. There is a feeling within the United States that, just as you said, we are on the cusp. The next 12 to 18 months, something feels awry. Something certainly feels strange. What's your take on Pope Francis, all the things that he's been saying? How do you view him?
He's the first. I think it's important to understand the peculiar role within the Vatican of the Jesuits. And what we're seeing unfold before us is the first pope ever that was a Jesuit pope. And his predecessor advocated, and Tom Horn and Chris Putnam did a book on the Petrus Romanus, the succession, and they predicted that the then sitting pope would advocate. And a year after they published it, that's exactly what he did do. And he advocated. And he's now in charge of the Vatican Observatory, which is preparing itself to receive an alien visitor, strangely enough. Now, that's too bizarre to swallow too quickly without breaking into it, but you discover that the current pope, he calls himself Francis, is a Jesuit, the first Jesuit to hold office, which tells you there's been some huge fundamental changes within the Vatican structure. So there's a lot going on. And Tom Horn and Chris Putnam have done a couple of books, an Exo Vaticana being perhaps one of the most provocative ones. So that's a great, we can go do some homework there, because they are very competent watchers, if you will. Malachi Martin was murdered because he predicted some of these things, and the Satan worship that goes on inside the Vatican and so forth. So the point is there's a whole, you can spend a lot of energy trying to focus on that, but clearly there's some fundamental changes going on. But again, I think we're best served by doing our biblical homework and staying on the sidelines and just watching, and be cautious about making forecasts.
Good for you. Thank you so much, Chuck. My guest today, Chuck Missler, the founder of the Koinonia House Ministry, who I have heard that Robert Downey Jr. even follows quite closely, khouse.org.
We're approved by Iron Man.
That's right.
Yes, he's conspicuously plugged us very colorfully. We get a lot of kidding about that. But there is a long history, a very positive history with him. That's good. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to be on your program, and I'll be glad to be responsive in the future if it serves a purpose. But in the meantime, let's really take the Bible seriously and do our homework.
Chuck, in the final moments, would you share with our audience how they can contact you and learn more about your work?
Well, we have a website in the U.S. called khouse.org, KHOUSE.org, and we also maintain a international one in New Zealand, kitrust.org, then TRUST.org. And we have literally hundreds of hours of materials available on those different passages there. And our main issue is to get people excited about the Bible, and our real goal is to try to repair the biblical illiteracy, not only in the pews but also in the pulpits. I think the great tragedy to the American church, especially, is that we as practitioners have failed to really learn our Bibles. And that's why that's been our primary thrust for 5 decades now, is to take the Bible seriously with a very high hermeneutic. We think that it's the most exciting discovery we can make. So I'll leave you with that, my friend.